The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Education, leading the world of digital and video learning. Discovery Education, connect to a world of learning.
Although he's usually credited with developing the theory of evolution, it's more accurate to say that Charles Darwin introduced the theory of natural selection, the mechanism for evolution, in 1859. More than 20 years before, Darwin had set sail aboard the HMS Beagle to study the flora and fauna of South America, despite the fact that he was perpetually seasick.
Oh my.
Well into the 5-year study, Darwin reached the Galapagos Islands.
The natural history of this archipelago is very remarkable. It seems to be a little world within itself. The greater number of its inhabitants, both vegetable and animal, being found nowhere else.
Among the animals Darwin found were lots of birds, finches to be precise. He collected 13 varieties, all very much alike except for the size and shape of their beaks.
I came to the conclusion that all the finches were descended from one species.
Over a long period of time, the birds' beaks had changed. Each was adapted to the kind of food available in their local area. Seed eaters' beaks were different from insect eaters' beaks, and so on. From this and other observations, Darwin developed the theory of natural selection. Certain conditions must be met for natural selection to occur.
There must be a population of things that can make copies of themselves. The copying process must be imperfect, and the copying errors must lead to differences in the ability of the offspring to survive and make copies of themselves.
These copying errors may result in the offspring being better suited to their environment. Or perhaps not. But if the changed offspring are better able to survive, then that change will likely endure and spread throughout the population over generations. For example, there is a species of moth, Biston betullaria, but hardly anyone calls them that ranges in color from light to dark. A population of them lived in a birch forest. Light-colored moths blended with the tree bark, but darker ones stood out against the white birch bark. Birds ate more dark moths because they were easier to spot, leaving mostly light-colored moths to reproduce. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, air pollution. The white birch bark turned sooty gray. Now the pale moths were more visible to birds, and the darker ones were camouflaged.
Oh no!
Birds began eating more pale-colored moths.
Wahoo!
In less than 100 years, the population of moths shifted from mostly pale to mostly dark.
In this example, it pays to be different. When natural selection favors a single trait, such as color, it's called directional selection.
Remember the Galapagos finches? During droughts, birds with strong, large, or very long bills were better equipped to survive. Those with average, medium bills were out of luck.
This is an example of disruptive selection. It pays to be a survivor with the right equipment.
But sometimes it pays to be average. The third distinct type of natural selection is called stabilizing selection, and it favors individuals that are the most like everyone else.
Over time, the most common traits are favored, and the extreme ones are reduced or even eliminated.
Today, the scientific evidence for evolution and natural selection underscores the complexity and beauty of biological design. would a bee protect her hive by stinging an intruder, even if she dies by doing so? Why would an animal call out a warning to her herd
Everybody look out!
and risk making herself a predator's target?
Oh no!
This type of behavior puzzled scientists. What evolutionary role could such generosity possibly play in the quest for survival? For the answer, we need to look deep, really deep, into the very stuff we are made of, in fact. Proteins, their DNA building blocks, and genes themselves. Usually, our genes are faithful copies from our parents, half from one and half from the other. But occasionally, a gene is not copied correctly. The offspring begins life with a new gene called a mutation. A mutation that improves the chances of survival or reproduction is likely to be passed on to the next generation. In the 1970s, British evolutionary theorist Richard Dawkins came up with a theory that genes are selfish. Of course, genes don't have thoughts or feelings, but it helps to think of them this way. They want to spread more copies of themselves, mutations and all, through the population.
Along the same lines, a gene that would enable lions to run faster and catch more prey would also allow them to survive longer and thus have more offspring. In this way, the selfish gene can accomplish its goal of spreading itself throughout the lion population.
But while we can think of genes behaving selfishly, there are many examples in nature of unselfish behavior. Altruism. That is, one organism helping another at a cost to itself.
One of the most obvious examples is parenting. Parents will risk their own lives to bear, nurture, and protect their young.
So how can genes achieve their selfish ends and still allow such altruistic traits to reoccur? The answer is surprisingly simple. A gene which makes its bearer behave altruistically can spread through the population so long as the generous behavior is directed toward other organisms that have the same gene. So although altruism has a cost for one member of a species, it helps the species as a whole to survive. Imagine that you are a cave person. You find a nice tree with lots of fruit. Should you tell the other cave people about the tree or not?
The selfish thing to do, would be to keep quiet. Then I'll have all the fruit for myself. They might die of hunger, but I will survive.
Now imagine you are the caveman's genes.
If the other cave people are told about the tree, they'll be more likely to survive and have offspring.
Hold it right there. Oh, this smells of genetic determinism to me. Our genes don't control us. Our morals and principles do.
My selfish gene theory does not say that animal behavior is completely determined by the genes, only that genes have some effect on behavior.
Oh, well, that's a bit different then. Have some peach flambe.
Don't mind if I do. That's awfully altruistic of you.
The question of why male peacocks have such elaborate tails plagued evolutionary biologists. What possible purpose could such ornamentation serve? How could natural selection favor a trait that might not only attract predators, but make it difficult to run away from them?
Yikes!
Would wearing a long gown and heels help you win a marathon?
Ouch!
Not likely. Charles Darwin argued that pretty tails help peacocks attract mates.
Look at me!
Isn't he cute?
Hubba hubba.
So what am I, chopped liver? And that peahens prefer males with big, bright tails.
Oh my!
A peacock with a small drab tail might live longer, but he probably wouldn't be popular with the ladies. What's wrong with me? With no offspring to carry on the drab tail line, the genes for these traits would soon die out. But why do peahens prefer males with big, bright tails?
That's pretty desirable.
The answer? Only healthy, well-fed birds can grow big tails. No, my tail is killing me. So peahens bypass scrawny-tailed males and choose the flashy ones
Look at me!
based on the strength of their reproductive potential.
Nice.
In fact, when shown males with artificial tails bigger than the bird's natural ones,
Look at my tail.
peahens will choose the artificially enhanced males.
Check it out.
Dreamy. I pick him. He's super.
Hubba hubba.
He's my choice.
If an organism lives to be 1,000 years old but has no offspring, it might as well not have lived at all as far as its genes are concerned. So natural selection is not just about survival, it's also about successful reproduction. Natural selection for courtship purposes is called sexual selection, and it can help attract mates and drive off rivals.
King of the jungle.
The gaudy looks and macho behavior are usually, but not always, displayed by males.
I can bench more than you.
Yeah, so what?
In species where females do the choosing, they don't need the costly adornments and weapons, saving their energy instead for bearing and raising offspring. There are many species, however,
Here I am, honey.
where the male expends as much energy or more in raising the offspring as the female does.
Off I go. Bye, honey. Not too much TV.
But in a process called runaway selection, things can get a bit bizarre. Take the example of the now extinct Irish elk. One theory was that under constant sexual selection, the elk's antlers increased in size because males were using them to attract mates and drive off the competition. The antlers eventually became so huge
Blimey, I'm stuck. Nice antlers.
that some evolutionary biologists wonder whether the Irish elk could have lasted much longer. That is, if climate change hadn't gotten to him first.
A little help here.
In the rich variety of human culture, courtship is a far more complex affair.
Wow.
But evolutionary psychologist Jeffrey Miller had an interesting theory.
The human capacity to create and appreciate art, music, and poetry did not evolve because it provided any survival benefit, but rather because it helped our ancestors seduce their potential mates.
This idea that our artistry functions as a sexual display is controversial and awaits rigorous testing. However, it is undeniable that the capacity for culture is much more highly developed in humans than in any other species. And that's pretty desirable. What do you get if you cross a mouse with a mango? Don't be ridiculous. You can't cross a mouse with a mango because they are reproductively isolated. The two species have completely separate gene pools that cannot be combined. In biology, a species is a group of individuals that can interbreed. A gene pool for a species is the set of genes in the population at any given time. Evolution is a change in the gene pool of a population over time. So when two groups are reproductively isolated, like the mouse and the mango, they have separate gene pools and are therefore considered two different species. Speciation is the process by which new species are created. There are several ways this can happen. Imagine, for example, a population of mice that can interbreed because they are all of the same species. A flood comes along, causing the landscape to change, and isolates one group of mice from the other. The two groups can no longer breed due to physical separation. Now imagine a few thousand years pass and suddenly an earthquake occurs, reuniting the two populations. But now they can't interbreed anymore. What happened? Thanks to several millennia of separation, the mice may look different or behave differently, or have other genetic changes that make interbreeding impossible. Even though they are no longer physically separated, something keeps them apart. Because the two groups are now reproductively isolated, they are considered different species.
Speciation by geographic separation is called allopatric speciation, while speciation that occurs without physical barriers is called sympatric speciation.
Different species can look quite similar. For example, South American jaguars and African leopards are both large spotted cats, but different species. Species that are physically separated for a very long time may undergo parallel evolution. which is they might evolve in very similar ways after splitting off from a common ancestor. In cases of convergent evolution, unrelated species evolve in similar ways. For example, birds, insects, and bats all fly and have wings, but they evolved from different ancestors.
Divergent evolution is what happens when a population splits off and becomes a new species. The two species, though closely related, develop new traits to better help them fit into their environments.
All of these examples are based on species that reproduce sexually. That is, two parents each contribute to the genetic makeup of the offspring. In species that reproduce asexually or without sex, including many one-celled organisms, insects, and plants, each offspring is genetically identical to its single parent. In other words, each offspring is a clone. Even so, occasional mutations can still occur when a DNA strand is damaged by a chemical reaction or even a cosmic ray. Every so often, a mutation will actually survive and the cell will reproduce, resulting in a new strain of bacteria, for example, or a new variety of tomato. The species is the most important way we have of grouping organisms. Below the species level are different varieties or subspecies. These different varieties all belong to the same species because they can interbreed, but have some distinguishing feature. Take poodles and German shepherds, for instance.
You could breed them together, but would you really want to?
The process of evolution can be summarized in 7 words. Genes mutate. Individuals are selected. Populations evolve.
And you'll probably never be able to cross a mouse with a mango.
DNA, the chemical that determines what characteristics an organism will inherit, can change, giving rise to offspring that are different from their parents, which can lead to new species, which can change even more over time, giving rise to a marvelous diversity of life forms, from jaguars to junipers, from bacteria to blue whales.
But despite the tremendous variation in shapes, sizes, and ways of getting through life, all organisms on Earth have remarkable similarities in biochemistry. Evolutionary theory states that these similarities are strong evidence of a common origin.
Back when Earth was formed, about 4.6 billion years ago, conditions were very different than they are today. If you had been alive then, well, you really couldn't have been. That's because the primitive Earth atmosphere contained mainly methane and ammonia, not exactly a breath of fresh air. And even if you had been able to breathe, it wouldn't have been a lot of fun with all the volcanic activity and lightning and everything covered with water vapor. So how did we get from that inorganic activity to this organic activity that allowed life to grow? In the 1920s, John Haldane and Alexander Oparin theorized that lightning provided the energy to spark the production of organic chemicals, precursors to life.
In 1953, I, Stanley Miller, devised an experiment that passed an electrical current through a mixture of hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon, water, ammonia, and methane. Within just a few days, complex organic molecules, including amino acids, were formed. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein. I had found a way to jump from inorganic to organic chemistry.
On the primordial Earth, this would have turned the seas into a warm organic soup. And while it wasn't very tasty, this concentration of chemicals may have created a primitive cell-like structure called a proteinoid sphere. As these structures reproduced, there would have been occasional errors in the copying process, slowly giving rise to other life forms.
A common origin for all living things is not such a stretch when you consider that all organisms share a similar chemistry, including similar DNA.
Similarities in DNA can be used to determine how closely related two types of animals are.
For example, the DNA of the domestic dog is more similar to human DNA than it is to the DNA of mice. The DNA of the domestic dog and the wolf differ by just 0.2%, even though we can be quite different in appearance. Both dogs and wolves belong to the same species, Canis lupus, with the domestic dogs being classified into the subspecies Canis lupus familiaris.
Although coyotes and wolves look pretty similar, our DNA differs by 4%, indicating that dogs and wolves diverged more recently than coyotes and wolves.
The Linnaean system classifies organisms according to morphology, that is, by structural similarities and differences. This system allows fossils to be included in the evolutionary tree. Since the 1960s, another classification system has emerged called cladism, emphasizing the importance of common ancestry. Advances in DNA sequencing have furthered this approach. However, neither system shows the whole picture, and so far no one has been able to blend the two into a unified view. But as evolutionary theory states, duck or dachshund, human or hermit crab, we all came from the same soup. According to the principles of natural selection, animals best adapted to survive in their environment are more likely to produce offspring, causing the beneficial adaptation to spread throughout the population. Each succeeding generation should be better adapted than the previous one. So, after millions of years of evolution, we might expect animals to be perfectly suited to their environments. Take horses, for example. While they will bite or kick a predator if cornered, they mainly rely on their speed to escape being brunch. Although hooves are very useful for fleeing across the plains, wheels are faster and more efficient. So why don't horses have wheels?
Wheels are a complex change. They have to be round. They have to have axles and so on. So even if a wheel mutation occurred, it would be unlikely to happen in one step.
But complex changes can occur through an accumulation of smaller changes that accrue over generations, rather than in a single mutation. This kind of cumulative natural selection can design anything, no matter how complex, provided there is a possible sequence of many small steps leading up to the complete complex design. For example, woodpeckers' long beaks are great for fishing insects from tree bark. It's easy to picture a bird with a short beak having offspring with slightly longer beaks that were able to gather a few more insects.
I am more successful at gathering food than those with shorter beaks, and therefore have a survival advantage. My long-beaked mutation would likely spread throughout the population. Repeat this cycle again and again, and the end result would be the modern woodpecker.
Unlike long-beaked woodpeckers, however, wheeled horses seem unlikely to have developed through a series of smaller mutations, because the intermediate steps required, axles without wheels, not quite round wheels, wheels that wouldn't turn, would be detrimental to survival. Natural selection eliminates organisms with harmful mutations, but it is not the only force driving evolution. Neutral mutations, changes that have no effect on an organism's ability to survive, can still persist due to luck.
And some features are actually byproducts of other adaptations. The white color of our bones, for instance, is not an adaptation. It has no purpose. But it is the byproduct of the fact that our bones are made from calcium.
Beneficial mutations are quite rare. When you have a complex design, there are more ways to make it worse than there are to make it better. Take a clock, for example. You might try to make one cog larger or smaller, or make a spring stronger. But since the clock is already pretty well designed, you'll probably foul it up. But even if horses don't have wheels, nature is full of examples of animal adaptations just as extraordinary.
In addition to spiny armor, hedgehogs have a circular skin muscle that contracts to form a bag for us to hide in.
Alligators have 3 eyelids. One works sideways and is transparent so that we can see underwater. We can also swallow food underwater too, thanks to a special flap of skin at the back of our throat.
If being a mammal with a duck-shaped bill isn't strange enough for you, consider that platypus males have spurs on their hind feet that deliver poisonous venom along with a swift kick. Crikey!
And what about camels? We can store fat in our humps to survive long periods without food. We can even metabolize fat to make water.
The theory of natural selection shows that none of these incredible adaptations occurred overnight.
Look at me!
It takes many tiny changes over millennia to make a camel. Evolutionary theory takes into account the beauty and mystery of nature's design. So no one can say with certainty that millennia from now, pigs won't have wings or horses won't have wheels.